At exactly 3:12 a.m., I shot out of bed thinking someone had broken in, because what else makes a roar like a freight train inside your house? My feet hit the floor and were immediately greeted by cold, ankle-deep water. That's when I realized the sound wasn't a burglar. It was my basement, actively turning into the set of a disaster movie. Water gushed through the walls like my house had been cursed by Poseidon himself, and all I could do was stand there, soaked pajama bottoms clinging to my legs, whispering, "What the hell is happening?" 10 minutes later, flashlight in hand, I discovered the source, an entire torrent of runoff from the street, pouring directly into my lower level like it had a personal vendetta. And the best part? It was thanks to the HOA's brand new drainage improvements. They'd literally rerouted stormwater away from the community garden and straight into my house. When I called them the next morning in full fury, Karen, the queen bee of our HOA, actually laughed and said, "Well, maybe you shouldn't have built a house with a basement." That's when I knew. These people weren't just negligent. They were smug. But what Karen didn't know, and what made me smile like a lunatic as I stood knee-deep in my ruined man cave, was that I had something they hadn't planned for. A very specific, very powerful insurance policy, and it covered every drop. By sunrise, my basement resembled a failed water park attraction. Rugs floated like ghost ships, my treadmill had short-circuited itself into a smoking mess, and the only thing still dry was my unopened box of dehumidifiers, which now sat ironically at the top of a shelf, mocking me. My dog, Rufus, stood at the top of the basement stairs, refusing to go down, looking at me like I was the idiot who built an aquarium under the living room. I tried not to scream as I walked through the damage. The smell of soggy drywall and destroyed electronics filled the air. I snapped photos, one by one, documenting everything. I knew the HOA would try to wiggle out of this, but I also knew something they didn't. I'd once worked as a commercial insurance analyst, and I had learned to read the fine print. Years ago, during an over-caffeinated conversation with my agent, I'd agreed to an obscure add-on to my policy, one that specifically protected me from third-party negligence, including homeowners associations. At the time, it had felt unnecessary. Now, it felt like I'd been handed Excalibur. When the plumber showed up, he confirmed my suspicions almost immediately. "Yeah, this isn't a burst pipe. The pressure's coming from outside, street level. This is runoff, not an interior leak." He gave me a look. "You got enemies at City Hall or something?" I gave a dry laugh and told him, "Worse. I've got an HOA." The plumber nodded, as if that explained everything. And it kind of did. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with Karen. She picked up on the first ring, her tone clipped and confident. "Yes, I heard there was some water intrusion on your property," she said, as if I'd misplaced a shoe and not had my basement turned into Atlantis. I explained the situation, clearly, firmly, professionally. Her response? "Our drainage improvement plan was approved by the board and executed by licensed contractors. If your house wasn't built to code, that's not our concern." I told her the contractors had literally jackhammered the edge of the community's storm gutter and redirected water away from the slope behind the clubhouse. She replied, "Yes. To prevent erosion." I asked, "Erosion into what?" "My property." And she said, "This is real. Well, technically, erosion is a natural process." That's when I decided I wasn't going to play nice. Karen had always been a little tyrant in yoga pants. She once fined a neighbor for putting out Halloween decorations too early because skeletons don't vibe with community values. Another time, she sent an official notice to an elderly veteran because his American flag was too large and too flappy. So when I realized her precious construction project had wrecked my home, I knew she would fight to avoid blame. What she didn't know was that I'd already contacted my insurance agent, Dan, a delightful lunatic who wore Hawaiian shirts year-round and once told me he built his career around catching HOA fraud. When I called Dan and explained what happened, he simply whistled. "Oh, buddy," he said. You've got the HOA special clause. I haven't seen one of those triggered in years. They're gonna hate this. Dan immediately scheduled an adjuster to come out. And not just any adjuster, he said with glee. You're getting Barry. I'd never met Barry, but from Dan's tone, I pictured a cross between Sherlock Holmes and a retired UFC fighter. When Barry arrived the next morning, I realized I was only half wrong. He was a lanky, sunburned guy in his 60s wearing cargo shorts, flip-flops, and a GoPro mounted on a chest strap like he was about to go snorkeling in my ruined laundry room. He shook my hand, sniffed the air, and said, "Ah yes, that's the smell of third-party liability. Let's document the hell out of this." Barry got to work fast. He took water samples, ran elevation readings, and traced the flow line of the runoff from the curb straight through a poorly dug trench that ended near my foundation. They didn't install any retaining break, he muttered, pointing at the muddy canal that now decorated the side of my home like a scar. This wasn't drainage work. This was a lawsuit with shovels. As Barry recorded everything, I could already imagine Karen's reaction. She thought she could dismiss me with a shrug and a snide comment about building codes. She didn't realize she'd rerouted that flood directly into a contractual trap, one where the insurance company wasn't just going to pay me, but would turn around and sue the HOA to recover damages. And since my claim had already been accepted, the storm wasn't coming for me anymore. It was coming for them. The best part? Barry discovered evidence that the work had been done without proper city inspection. No permit, no oversight, just a group of power-hungry suburban monarchs directing a construction crew like they were building pyramids for their dog park. As Barry packed up his GoPro and said, "I'll see you in the payout phase," I sat back in my soggy armchair and grinned. The HOA thought I'd just roll over. They thought I'd eat the cost, keep my mouth shut, maybe beg for help. What they didn't know was that I'd spent years learning how to fight exactly this kind of battle. And this time, I had paperwork, an adjuster in flip-flops, and a fireproof binder full of policy gold. Let them bring their smug smiles and cease and desist letters. I had a basement full of receipts, and every one of them was dripping with consequences. The HOA meeting was called with less than 24 hours' notice, which was standard practice for when they didn't want a crowd or any actual accountability. I showed up anyway, still half smelling like basement mildew despite 3 showers and an industrial fan. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, an aggressively beige room that smelled like coffee, printer ink, and passive aggression. At the head of the folding table sat Karen, arms crossed, eyes already narrowed. Beside her were Chad, the HOA vice president who always wore polos 2 sizes too tight, and Bob, the treasurer, who looked like he'd wandered in by accident but was somehow still in charge of our financial reserves. The moment I walked in, Karen smirked like a cat that had swallowed a lawyer. I stayed calm. That was the plan. No yelling, no finger-pointing. Just facts. Unfortunately, Karen hated facts almost as much as she hated lawn ornament. "Before we begin," she said with mock authority, "let the minutes show that the HOA is not responsible for weather events, acts of God, or personal landscaping failures." I sat down slowly, folded my hands and said, "Let the minutes also show that your contractors didn't have permits, rerouted water illegally, and your project caused $89,000 in damages to my home." Karen blinked, just once, and then gave a fake chuckle. "I understand emotions are high, but assigning blame won't fix your basement." "No," I said, "but liability insurance will." That wiped the smile clean off her face. Chad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Bob looked up from whatever crossword puzzle he was doing on the back of the budget printout. Karen straightened her stack of papers and gave me her favorite line. "We don't recognize private insurance claims against the HOA. All issues must go through our internal grievance process." That was their classic deflection: trap residents in months of HOA-run reviews, while stalling any real consequence. I smiled. "Great. You'll be getting served next week then. My insurance company is filing for full damages." They already approved my claim. She sputtered for a moment before regaining her composure. You're trying to bankrupt the HOA over a little water? A little water? I said. Karen, my water heater tried to float. My dryer unplugged itself and swam for safety. That's not a leak. That's a home invasion with waves. Chad tried to intervene with his signature uselessness. Let's all take a breath. The drainage upgrade was meant to prevent erosion behind the tennis courts. It wasn't targeted. No, I said calmly. It was just grossly incompetent. Karen leaned in, eyes narrowed like a villain from a low-budget soap opera. This is harassment. No, I replied. This is accountability. You've spent years running this HOA like your own personal fiefdom. Now you messed with someone who knows what a liability clause is. Just then, as if the universe timed it perfectly, Barry walked in uninvited. He wore the same cargo shorts, a windbreaker, and carried a thermos that probably had coffee but looked suspiciously like it could contain whiskey. Hiya, he said, flashing his adjuster badge like it was a sheriff's star. Sorry to barge in. Just need to confirm a few things for the claim investigation. Karen, you're the acting president, right? Karen's face turned a new color, somewhere between rage and regret. This is a private meeting. You can't just barge in. Barry nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Because your HOA bylaws require open meetings unless it's a disciplinary hearing. Which this isn't, since you didn't properly file a violation notice or give the required 72 hours. Chad blinked like a toddler told Santa isn't real. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Bob, from his corner, muttered, I told you we should have read the damn handbook. Barry walked casually around the room, pulling out a mini-tablet and showing us video stills. Here's your contractor breaking the curb. Here's water running through the trench they dug straight toward the victim's house. Oh, and here's the lack of any retaining structure, which violates City Code Section 9-4-232. He paused, sipping from the thermos. Fun fact. This drainage plan rerouted runoff from community property onto private land. That's textbook negligence. Karen tried to regain footing. We had no way of knowing. You signed off on it, Barry interrupted. Got your signature right here. And funny thing, the contractor noted on the form that you declined a second inspection. Karen's lips pursed into a line so thin it might have sliced paper. Chad looked at her like she'd just invited a tiger into the clubhouse. Bob just went back to his crossword, muttering, What's a 9-letter word for lawsuit? Barry looked around and smiled. Anyway, just wanted to say hello. We'll be in touch. Oh, and Karen? You're gonna want to update your liability umbrella. This is gonna rain. He left without another word. I sat there, fighting every urge to fist pump. Karen, in full damage control mode, suddenly turned diplomatic. Maybe we should look into resolving this amicably. No, I said. You had your chance. You could have come to me, taken responsibility, or even said sorry. Instead, you mocked me and tried to deflect. Now my insurance company's involved, and they don't do amicable. They do paperwork and lawyers. She tried a softer tone. We could consider partial reimbursement in exchange for dropping your claim. I stood up. You don't get to negotiate with other people's money, Karen. The claim's already filed. You should probably let your board know. Things are about to get very expensive. Outside the clubhouse, I took a deep breath of fresh air and called Dan to update him. Barry's a beast, I told him. I know, Dan said. I once saw him reduce a condo association to tears at a Chili's. I walked home, sloshing slightly in my still damp shoes, but feeling lighter. I'd faced the board, played by their rules, and then flipped the table using their own bylaws. But something told me Karen wasn't done. People like her don't go down without clawing. And I was right. Because later that night, a violation notice appeared on my door, citing me for excessive foliage in front of porch light, a made-up rule if I'd ever heard one. The HOA had just made it personal. That's when I realized this wasn't just about water damage anymore. This was war. They'd tried to flood me out. Now they were trying to paper-cut me to death with fines and bogus infractions. But they didn't understand that every time they pushed, they were adding fuel to the fire. I had the law, the policy, and a flood-damaged home turned evidence vault. And I was just getting started. 3 days later, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox like a threat disguised in legal stationery. Inside was a letter from Karen's newest ally, some HOA specialized attorney she had apparently recruited from her Wednesday morning yoga group. The letter was a hilariously dramatic cease and desist, accusing me of defamation, emotional harassment, and something called slander by implication. It read like a script for a legal soap opera, complete with phrases like "cease all hostile rhetoric" and "refrain from future inflammatory accusations during community correspondence." I couldn't tell if I was being sued or politely asked to shut up. Either way, it wasn't going to work. What Karen didn't realize was that every scare tactic they threw at me was just more ammo for my case, and my insurance company loved ammo. I handed the letter to Dan, my insurance agent, who read it while munching on a microwave burrito and chuckled like he was watching a sitcom. "Classic HOA panic move," he said. "Empty legal bark, no bite. We're already filing subrogation paperwork against them. This just makes it better." Then he pulled out a folder with an evil grin. And Barry's put together a highlight reel. The highlight reel was an actual video montage compiled by Barry's GoPro footage and drone clip. He had aerial shots of the improperly dug trench, footage of the water channeling directly into my foundation, and even a slow-motion segment showing Karen yelling at a contractor to just finish it before anyone sees. It was the HOA equivalent of a smoking gun, and Barry treated it like his magnum opus. "Oh, and wait till you see the infrared," he said. "Caught heat signatures of water flow across property lines. Infrared, man. This case is locked." But while my team was collecting evidence and preparing to legally body slam the HOA, Karen was doubling down on her reign of pettiness. I received 2 more violation notices, one for non-conforming mulch color and another for wind chimes causing auditory disruption. I didn't even own wind chimes. When I asked for proof, Karen sent a blurry photo of a neighbor's backyard, claiming it was mine. It was absurd and laughable, but it also made one thing clear. Karen wasn't just trying to escape accountability, she was trying to wear me down. So I escalated too. I reached out to a local investigative reporter named Valerie, who had a small but loyal following online. She'd previously exposed a town council embezzlement scheme using nothing but drone footage and gossip from PDA moms. I gave her the rundown, the documents, the permit violations, the insurance filings, and even let her interview Barry, who absolutely loved the attention. Valerie published a piece titled, "Flooded by Authority: When Your HOA Becomes Your Worst Neighbor," and within hours, it was trending in local news. The comments section exploded with similar horror stories from other HOA victims, and suddenly, Karen wasn't just my problem, she was a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked homeowner power. Karen, of course, tried to fight the narrative. The next morning, she attempted the worst PR stunt I've ever witnessed. She dragged a garden hose into her backyard and created a puddle next to her shed. Then she called the same news crew to film her complaining about recent flooding affecting board members too. The whole thing was hilariously fake. You could see her son standing off to the side, occasionally turning the hose back on when the puddle dried up. The best part was my dog Rufus wandering into the shot mid-interview and drinking from the hose puddle like it was his personal protest. Valerie aired the clip unedited. Meanwhile, the insurance process hit full throttle. Barry's report was submitted, reviewed, and greenlit. The payout was official, nearly $90,000 to cover structural damage, appliance replacement, mold treatment, and property restoration. But the real bombshell was the subrogation lawsuit. The insurance company wasn't just stopping at reimbursing me, they were coming after the HOA for every penny. They named the HOA as liable for negligence, misuse of community funds, unpermitted construction, and reckless endangerment. Karen, Chad, and Bob were all listed in the complaint as responsible officers. When word of the lawsuit spread, neighbors began whispering in driveways. The HOA, once feared and obeyed like a local monarchy, was starting to crack. People who had once stayed silent out of fear of retaliation began to speak up. I received a handwritten letter from an elderly couple down the block, thanking me for standing up to the nonsense. Another neighbor dropped off photos they had secretly taken during the trenching project, photos showing Karen yelling at contractors to cut through the corner. No one checks back here anyway. The pressure was building, and the HOA board knew it. At the next meeting, Karen looked visibly rattled. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a forced calm that cracked every time someone mentioned the word lawsuit. Chad tried to offer a compromise, perhaps a small community reimbursement fund, but it was too late. Barry had video clips queued up for court, Valerie was asking for an on-camera comment, and my lawyer was already prepping for mediation. The HOA wasn't just cornered. It was leaking credibility like a sinking ship. Then, something unexpected happened. Late one night, I heard a knock at my door. It was the HOA secretary, a soft-spoken woman named Donna, who had always seemed like background noise at meetings. She looked nervous but determined. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "They ignored my warnings. They didn't follow procedure. I have copies of the original drainage plans and emails showing Karen knew the reroute was unsafe. I invited her in, and she laid everything out, time-stamped emails, internal messages, even a voicemail where Karen said, 'Just get it done, we'll deal with complaints later.' It was the nail in the coffin. Proof of foreknowledge and intentional negligence. By the end of the week, the insurance lawyers had everything they needed. I received a confirmation call from Dan, who sounded like a kid on Christmas morning. "You just turned a six-figure problem into an HOA meltdown. Congratulations. Also, Barry wants to know if he can buy you a beer." The HOA wasn't just facing financial ruin. It was facing a mutiny. The residents were furious. At an emergency open forum called by popular demand, Karen tried to explain her actions as necessary adjustments for community protection, but she was shouted down. People brought their own photos, emails, and violations. Bob sat silently, eyes glazed. Chad tried to interrupt one resident and was booed so hard he physically backed away from the microphone. Karen stood up one last time, clutching a binder like it might save her, and said, "We were trying to improve the neighborhood." Someone in the back shouted, "By flooding our homes and lying about it?" The room erupted. That night, the residents voted to trigger a special clause in the bylaws, one that allowed for the emergency removal of board members due to negligence. Karen, Chad, and Bob were all removed by overwhelming vote. The room didn't just cheer. It roared. And I stood there, watching the wave roll back to shore. They had tried to drown me in silence, in red tape, in bureaucracy. But instead, they triggered a flood of consequences, and this time, the water was justice. It took less than a week after the emergency vote for the full unraveling of the HOA to begin. The once untouchable board, run like Karen's personal HOA fiefdom, was now in complete chaos. The treasurer, Bob, formally resigned through a hastily typed letter that included the line, "I was just here for the free coffee," and enclosed his HOA credit card wrapped in a napkin. Chad vanished from public view entirely, deleting his social media accounts and reportedly booking a solo hiking retreat in Arizona, to disconnect from stress. Karen, however, refused to go quietly. She launched one last campaign to save face and spin the entire thing as a targeted vendetta against her leadership. She tried to send out a community-wide newsletter titled, "What Really Happened?" but the acting interim board blocked it from being distributed, citing misinformation and pending legal matters. Undeterred, Karen printed it herself and went door to door, stuffing her personal manifesto into everyone's mailboxes at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday like a rogue newspaper carrier with a grudge. Inside the letter were vague accusations about a conspiracy, a smear campaign, and something about infiltration by external insurance interests, which, I assumed, was a dramatic way of describing Barry walking around with his GoPro. It didn't help that one of the neighbors recorded Karen angrily delivering the newsletters while muttering to herself about the betrayal of Donna the traitor. That video, of course, went viral on the neighborhood group chat within the hour. At this point, the entire community was caught between a mix of frustration, disbelief, and the kind of guilty amusement normally reserved for reality TV. Meanwhile, the legal process was moving at full steam. The mediation between my insurance company and the former HOA board was scheduled, and I was asked to attend as a primary witness. Barry, who had by now upgraded from thermos to an actual travel mug with the phrase, "I sue HOAs for fun," arrived early, grinning like he'd just been handed the season finale of his favorite show. The session was held in a neutral office downtown, with long, sterile hallways and uncomfortable chairs, which felt poetic given how uncomfortable the HOA had made my life. Karen showed up with a new attorney, one who actually looked competent this time. Her face was tight, expression unreadable, though I caught the smallest twitch when she saw Barry waiting with a thick binder titled Evidence and Enjoyment. The mediation began with introductions and legal pleasantries, but it wasn't long before Barry started pulling out documents, video stills, permit violations, and contractor statements. My personal favorite was the side-by-side map comparison, one labeled Original HOA Drainage Plan and the other Actual Damage Path. The arrows on the second map basically screamed flood zone, and the red circle drawn around my house looked like a bullseye on a target. Karen's lawyer tried to argue contributory negligence, claiming my house's foundation wasn't reinforced properly. But Barry countered with the building permit, the inspection record, and a line that made me want to clap. The only thing not reinforced was their understanding of city code. Then came Donna's documentation. The emails, the internal notes, the voice recording of Karen instructing the contractor to cut corners and skip inspection to save budget, it all piled up like a slow-motion avalanche of guilt. By the time the second hour of mediation hit, Karen was visibly shrinking into her chair, flipping through papers like maybe one of them contained an escape hatch. The insurance lawyers didn't just demand full reimbursement for the payout, they tacked on legal fees, damage escalation clauses, and penalties for non-compliance. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a financial gut punch. Karen's lawyer asked for a recess and tried to negotiate a lower settlement, suggesting that the HOA could cover part of the damages through community reserves. That's when the current interim board representative, a calm retiree named Evelyn, leaned in and said, "There is no more community money for your mistakes, Karen. This comes from you." Karen looked stunned, like she'd finally realized that she wasn't just playing with other people's money anymore. She was being held personally accountable. She tried to object, to appeal to Evelyn's sense of neighborliness, but Evelyn didn't flinch. "You didn't care when you flooded his house," she said. "You didn't care when you fined people over mailbox paint. You don't get to ask for grace now." That mediation ended with a full settlement offer. Karen and the former board would be held liable for a six-figure payout. The insurance company got their money, my damages were fully covered, and the rest of the neighborhood didn't have to suffer for her actions. It was the rare kind of justice that doesn't just fix things, it makes things right. Afterward, as Barry packed up his binders and drone footage, he turned to me and said, "You ever thought about becoming an adjuster? You've got the rage for it." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Back at home, the restoration crew finished the final phase of repairs. My basement was no longer a waterlogged crypt of broken appliances. It was now upgraded, modernized, and fully waterproof. I installed a French drain system, replaced the flooring with waterproof vinyl planks, and even added a small bar in the corner, a tongue-in-cheek tribute to the disaster. My friends started calling it the flood zone, and honestly, it stuck. We celebrated the end of the ordeal with a small get-together. Neighbors who had once only waved from a distance now showed up with snacks, folding chairs, and stories of their own HOA nightmares. We laughed, shared our Karen horror stories, and for the first time in a long time, the community actually felt like a community. Donna came too, quiet as ever, but clearly relieved. I raised a glass to her and said, "To whistleblowers everywhere." She blushed and smiled. That night, after everyone left and Rufus finally passed out from begging for too many chips, I sat in my newly finished basement and thought about everything that had happened. The flood, the damage, the lies, the violations, it had been hell. But out of that chaos came a shift. The HOA was no longer a faceless power lording over everyone. It had been exposed, dismantled, and replaced by actual neighbors who cared more about safety than shrub height. It wasn't just a win in court. It was a win in the kind of fight most people never realize they can win. Of course, Karen wasn't done entirely. Rumor had it she tried to move to a neighboring HOA, but after someone sent them the news coverage and clips from her garden hose performance, her application was rejected. Apparently, her reputation had gone viral in the worst way. As for Barry, he sent me a postcard 2 weeks later from Florida, where he was celebrating the victory with sun, sand, and HOA litigation stories. The man really did love his job, and while I could finally relax, enjoy my dry home, and laugh about it all, I knew this wasn't just some petty neighborhood squabble. This was a reminder that bullies don't always come with fists. They come with bylaws and clipboards, but they fall the same way. You stand your ground, gather your proof, and when the time comes, you hit back harder. Preferably with waterproof boots and a policy clause they never saw coming. It's funny how quickly the mood of an entire neighborhood can shift once the fog of fear is lifted. Just a few months ago, most of the residents around here were too nervous to challenge a single line in a petty HOA violation letter. Now, they were standing around at community events, laughing about the time Karen tried to simulate a flood with a garden hose. What had once been a tightly controlled, rule-obsessed environment turned into something far more relaxed, still respectful, still clean and orderly, but without the constant dread of passive-aggressive notices taped to mailboxes. The new interim board, led by Evelyn, had taken a completely different approach: transparency, simplicity, and common sense. No more fines for mailbox color. No more citations for hanging a flag. No more midnight rule changes buried in obscure meeting note. I was invited to join the new board, which was flattering, but I turned it down with a polite laugh and a firm no. I told them I'd already waded through enough HOA drama to last a lifetime. Instead, I offered to help from the sidelines with documentation, advice, or the occasional insurance tip. That was enough for me. I didn't need power or a title. I already had what I really wanted: peace of mind, a dry basement, and a reputation that made people think twice before trying to push me around. The insurance settlement allowed for more than just repairs. It gave me the flexibility to upgrade, reinforce, and even enjoy the process. The bar in my basement was now a fully stocked corner with a neon sign that said, "The Flood Zone." It became the unofficial community hub, not in a formal sense, but in the way every good neighborhood has one house where people naturally gather. It wasn't about the drinks, it was about the symbolism. We'd turned a disaster into something social, something communal. That basement used to be a reminder of everything that went wrong. Now it was where we hosted poker nights, movie marathons, and, most recently, the first post-Karen HOA-free community potluck. Barry showed up to the potluck. He wasn't invited officially, but no one minded. He walked in wearing a Hawaiian shirt with tiny rain clouds on it and brought a tray of wings so spicy they became a challenge. He was greeted like a local legend. People shook his hand, asked him to retell the story of the GoPro footage, and even asked for tips on dealing with their own shady HOA. Barry, ever the humble adjuster, grinned and told stories like he was hosting a campfire. Karen, on the other hand, had vanished from the neighborhood entirely. After being removed from the board, sued for damages, and publicly embarrassed, she quietly sold her home. A for sale by owner sign popped up one morning without fanfare, and within a month she was gone. The new owners, a young couple with 2 toddlers and an open-door policy for block barbecues, fit in perfectly. No one talked about Karen much anymore, except in joke. She had become an urban legend, the punchline of HOA horror stories. Someone even made a bingo card of Karen's greatest hits, with squares for things like fined for hose placement and unauthorized wind chimes. The lawsuit had also triggered an audit of HOA funds. Turns out there were more than a few questionable expenses: gift cards, unnecessary consultation payments, and one bizarre charge labeled aesthetic consultant, which we later found out was Karen's cousin. The audit results were turned over to the city, and while it wasn't clear if charges would be filed, it was enough to ensure stricter oversight going forward. The new board put every expense on a public spreadsheet. Evelyn even joked about listing how many muffins they served at each meeting. The biggest change, though, wasn't in the finances or the bylaws. It was in the people. Neighbors started talking more. People who once avoided gatherings out of HOA anxiety began showing up. Kids played freely without someone counting how many minutes their toys sat on the front lawn. Gardens got a little wilder, porches got a little more colorful, and everyone just seemed to breathe easier. We had shaken off the pressure of micromanagement and learned how to actually live next to each other instead of under a watchful eye. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, Donna walked by and waved. She paused, walked up the steps, and handed me a small potted plant. "Peace lily," she said. "Figured it was fitting." I smiled. "You know, I didn't peg you for the whistleblower type." She shrugged. "Neither did I. But you were the first one who didn't just roll over. Made me think maybe it wasn't hopeless." We sat in silence for a moment, enjoying the breeze. There was no paperwork to worry about, no looming threat of anonymous complaint. Just 2 neighbors, sitting on a porch, watching Rufus attempt to chase a butterfly across the yard like it owed him money. A week later, I got a letter from the insurance company. Not bad news, just a simple note confirming the case was officially closed. Enclosed was a gift card and a note from Dan that read, "Thanks for making this fun. Don't flood the basement again, we're out of popcorn." Classic Dan. And just when I thought everything had quieted down, a strange email arrived. It was from a homeowners association 3 towns over. They had heard about the case, read the article, and wanted advice on how to prevent Karen-style collapses. They even offered to pay me for a consultation. I nearly spit out my drink laughing. Apparently, I'd become some sort of accidental expert on HOA disasters. I forwarded the email to Barry, who replied with one line, "Told you you'd be good at this." I never took the consultation gig, but it did make me think. Maybe people like Karen only rise to power because no one knows how to fight back. Maybe all it takes is one person refusing to let things slide. Maybe justice in suburbia doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with policy clauses, drone footage, and a well-timed whistleblower. As for me, I wasn't planning to take on any new fights. I had my house, my peace, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd weathered the storm and come out stronger. Literally and metaphorically. My basement was now the safest place in the house. The very thing they tried to ruin had become the foundation of a better life. No longer just concrete and insulation, but a symbol of what can happen when someone stands up to nonsense, wades through the mess, and floods the system with accountability. And if anyone ever tried something like that again, well, let's just say I keep a fresh copy of my insurance policy in a waterproof folder, just in case.